Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so welcome. This is Do-It-Yourself versus Manage. It's a little short on the slide, but we had to fit it on there. So just to introduce ourselves really quickly, I am Kyle Benson.
I am Benji Soto. I'm a product manager in Google Cloud. I do data visualizations and AI.
Yep, and I also work with the cloud, within the cloud operations suite. So we'll kind of go through what we're going to be covering today. I'll just call out, so originally, depending on when you may have signed up for this session, we were going to have someone from Wayfair join us. Unfortunately, Zubin had to cancel. He just wasn't able to make it. But so we'll quickly talk about sort of what they achieved. And if you're interested, they're also, Wayfair is in a couple of other locations throughout the sessions this week. So we're happy to answer any questions about them or maybe put you in touch with them just based off of what your interests are. So other than that, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the aspects people evaluate when they're looking at, DIY versus managed offerings, specifically in the observability space. I mean, we work within Cloud Operations Suite, and so at a high level, we spend a lot of time talking to customers about that. But we want to make sure, this is our sort of area of expertise, and so when we talk about that, a lot of the lessons learned that we've seen will be focused on it. So we'll cover a couple of things and sort of areas I think are I'd say area of importance, maybe not necessarily to everyone, but like when we think about sort of how people approach stuff and today how a lot of businesses think about this, it may not always line up with what I would suggest. So just to quickly talk about Wayfair. So as I mentioned, Wayfair is one of our customers of the year this year. That was a result of the work that they did with us. And we had a pretty great experience working with them. They've been great partners for us. But one of the big things for them is they came from an open source offering where ultimately they decided it was a little bit easier to migrate to the Cloud Operations Suite. And that originally started with cloud logging. And they used both our logging and metrics sort of views to handle this stuff. But ultimately, a really positive experience for them. They had 25% OpEx savings on what they did, moving away from an open source pipeline. So a really great story, a really great experience for them, and we're really happy that they were able to speak more broadly about it. Although, like I said, Zubin couldn't be here today, and so I did want to sort of highlight in his own words what that really meant. And for them, this really started with an elastic open source based pipeline where they migrated really with a heavy focus on their log-based volume. That turned into using that for log-based metrics and using our visualization tools. And then also is now in the process of evaluating our managed service for Prometheus to sort of drive that home. So when we talk about what matters, I think, at the end of the day, what you're really talking about when you talk about DIY versus managed service is, that's the wrong button. There it is build versus buy, right? These have existed for a long time. I think as long as there's been software and even before software, the idea of build versus buy has always been, sort of the first place engineering teams start when they're thinking about what they're working on. And so really at the end of the day here is like, if the thing I'll say that's most important, and if you don't think about this day in and day out, or if you don't talk about it with your teams, the most important thing I'll say is just thinking about what's your mission and why it matters. And there's real implications for that, right? Prior to coming to Google, I was at Red Hat for 9 years, and I was there at a point where, I think Red Hat fairly well known, but if not, open source based software company, primarily or originally focused on Linux offerings and now very heavily focused in the container space. But when I was there, we were growing a lot, and we used an open source mail server, and we used, does anyone ever use Etherpad? Anyone familiar with that? No, okay. Okay, one in hand. So Etherpad was sort of an open source online collaboration tool for document writing. So ultimately, as we started to grow, when I joined, there was like 4,000 people at that company. We ultimately outgrew just some of the open source tooling there. It was too much for us to maintain and scale. And for Red Hat, that was sort of an internal dilemma, right? Red Hat really, truly believed in open source, and I think one of the reasons I came to Google is I think we also believe in that commitment to open source, but it wasn't critical to our day-to-day business. And so ultimately, we had to make the decision to move off of Etherpad and a really simple mail server. And they actually ended up adopting Google Workspace, right? Which is a happy story because I can use them as a sort of a quote here, right? But it worked out really well for them. It worked out really well for us, and it reduced the amount of friction we had while collaborating.
So what I'd like to do real quick is just run through an e-commerce example. So what's important for an e-commerce shop? Anyone? You want to sell products. You want to add to cart. You want to check out. That is how you run the business. To get there, you might invest in that product catalog. You might invest into relationships with suppliers, onshore or offshore, negotiating with those suppliers, buying those products. When you buy those products, how do you get those products from international markets or supplier zones to last mile delivery with that customer? And to do all of that, you might be using email, you might be collaborating with different employees, and you might be investing into a search algorithm to make these products discoverable on your storefront. Well, with the world of Google Cloud, much of that is already available for you. You can buy email from the cloud. You can buy collaboration tools so your employees can collaborate. You can leverage search algorithms from the Google Cloud using your data sets. And what that allows you to do is really focus on what really matters, which are your competitive differentiators. That way you're not focusing on all these other non-differentiators. So if you think about building these products, the build direction does feel the most creative because you get to express yourself, and who doesn't love building tech products, right? We all do, right? But in many cases, you should really think twice and really consider, should you actually buy it instead? Kyle's gonna talk a little bit more about how there are many costs that come with build versus buy.
Yeah, I think the sort of big one that glares at me a lot of the time when we talk to customers, when we meet them, on a day-to-day, weekly basis, whatever it is always this one, an opportunity cost. And I think, like, show of hands, who's familiar with the word opportunity cost or the phrase opportunity cost? Okay, cool. So actually, I'll say, when I just did in preparing for this talk, there was a Pew Research article that said something like, half of people surveyed knew what opportunity cost meant. But opportunity cost is at a high level the decision to do something based off of, sort of like, what are you missing as a result of not doing something else, right? So if you don't study for a test and you go to a movie instead, what's the opportunity cost? What is that ultimately, the impact of that on you? And so when we talk about opportunity cost in, sort of enterprise spaces, there are lots of teams that handle this really well. If you work in a large organization, maybe your procurement team handles this for you. If they do, maybe their models are really great. If not, maybe something that you need to start taking on within your own engineering org is really more focused on how do you assess that. And I'll say, at a high level, if you're in a large organization, your procurement team might have a strong understanding of some different models there. Like, one of the more popular ones is a Monte Carlo model, and that helps you sort of assess all the different factors and sort of all the different risks as a part of what you're doing. If you're a smaller organization, I just recommend this book, How to Measure Anything. We use this a lot within our DORA research, right? So if you've ever heard of DORA or any of the stuff we talk about there in terms of, like, how do we achieve velocity? How do people or teams that perform excellently actually, operate? This is a book recommended by one of the original researchers from that team. So I really encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, if it's sort of new to you in terms of how you represent your product team and what you're representing in your org, having some baseline of how to measure and understanding what your opportunity costs, I think, is going to be really important in most of these conversations. The second one you start to think about, especially within the observability space, is outage cost. And this is sort of a fun thing to maybe poke at, but if I think, Gartner a few years ago estimated that, per minute it was $5,600 USD for an outage. And the thing that we always sort of come back to is, if you have an outage or your observability platform has an outage, which one is it, right? How do you know that your business is not failing if you can't actually visualize what's going on? So we see this a lot, and in fact, I see this a lot specifically on the metric side when we talk about, or we talk with customers using sort of open source Prometheus, where they don't have the ability to visualize either on a regular basis. They don't have the retention periods that they need for their metrics. It's one of a couple of things like that, but we really see this pretty commonly. So outage cost really matters. I will say, that doesn't mean you can't ever have outages. There's always going to be some, and there's a level of acceptability there. If you're not familiar with outage and sort of how to calculate your outages correctly, I'd really recommend checking out the SRE book, which has a great guide to implementing SLOs. and sort of deciding what's important to you, right? Like 100% availability is almost never the answer. I think when you really think about it, most people are at 4 nines, 99.99. I've seen a couple of people ask for a 99.995, and that's really pushing it, right? Like what is that? I think if I'm not going to do the math right, but I think it's like 8 minutes a month, something like that. So like there's always going to be outages. 100% is never really going to be the answer. But there's things you can do to sort of improve that and sort of figure out how you measure that. So I'm going to go into a little bit more on the SRE stuff, only because SRE, if you've never heard that term, is Site Reliability Engineering. I'll use SRE going forward. But SRE is a methodology used at Google. It's used elsewhere too. So if you've never heard of that, there's lots of stuff here you can consume to sort of get more familiar with it. But one of the big factors in SRE is focusing on reducing toil. And so when we talk about toil, my first sort of real job was I was a Linux administrator, right? So maybe that's someone's role here. But for me, this always rings home very true. I also worked a lot in automation, especially when I was at Red Hat. So when I think about toil, I really have like very strong visual feelings on this, right? I can almost taste the amount of stress, But so when we think about this, there's a couple of things like, what is toil? Well, it's non-tactical, so it's almost always a reactive posture to something. It is lacking enduring value, and so the lacking enduring value is that if you do this, and there's a high likelihood you're going to do it again, right? And there's no opportunity for you to solve or improve upon that basis, that would be lacking enduring value. And then grows at least as fast as its source, right? And the idea there is like, if you as a business have a lot of toil and you are continuously growing, your toil is going to grow, right? It's going to grow commensurately with your business. And when you start to think about how teams work, how teams are managed, like that's a really important factor to sort of think about. Like this is our practical experience working at Google. That's where this book came from. But it's not only within Google, right? I think most people sort of understand this at a high level. So I left this second one like really sparse, and when we think about like how this affects productivity, right? So the reason I bring this up is like at its most basic, you want your team to be happy, you want the people inside your organization to be happy, but there's like if you're going to put this to a spreadsheet, there is a human cost to it, right? And so I would encourage you to check out the Eliminating Toil section of the book, but what does it cause, right? It causes confusion and it causes attrition, right? So if you have people who are constantly cycling in and out of your organization, that's definitely going to lead to confusion and ultimately will lead to a less valuable product for you or your end users. And I don't think that can be understated. Does anyone remember Dexter's Lab? All right, cool. All right, I got a couple people. So this is my idea of toil. This is the best example of that I could find. In the original show, when I was, I guess, a kid, he's super happy to be doing this, and then very quickly it turns into just a monotonous day in, day out thing. And that's what it feels like when you're toiling away at something, right? I always like that word because it's sort of, it just sounds painful. I don't know. So when you think about this, there's a couple of things to factor in. And this is something we see a lot of the time, especially when we start talking about open source software is, the idea of human cost, and the idea there is like, well, if I'm going to stand up my own, again, I'll lean back on Prometheus. If I stand up my own Prometheus stack, like how much time am I going to have my team focused on this? I would say it's almost always an underestimation for people when we meet them, right? But that's why they're meeting with us. So there's a little bit of bias there, but ultimately this is something that really affects most teams. And as you start to grow, especially in a tool like Prometheus or other spaces, not only does the capacity come up higher on your actual compute resources, but it also increases in terms of your individual status, or your human status, I should say. So the next thing we're going to talk about is gratis v. libre, and I like this slide, I like this sort of definition because we used to always say this, and I'll come to the quote in a second, but when we talk about open source software, there is an idea that open source software is free. Open source software is free, right? I mean, that's the sort of statement. And there's obviously always a cost behind that, and I think a lot of people get into that with us. But I like this slide because the word gratis is, I guess I should say it's Latin. I shouldn't say that with certainty. But gratis focuses on the idea that it comes without a cost, and libre is like freedom, right? Liberty. And so both of those things mean free, especially in the English language. Like it's a very, it's not a clear distinction. When we say open source software is without a cost, I would say that's not true. It's this one, right? We're talking about liberty. You have the liberty and the freedom to do what you want with it. And that's like maybe like an esoteric pitch on it, but I'll say like generally, we believe open source software is important. If you look at, this is like a really, really terrible chart for you to all look at, but I'm gonna make you do 3 more after this. If you look at our contributions to CNCF, this was I did this at the beginning of the month, but this is us, this is Google, and that's everyone else contributing to the CNCF. This is a 6-month span. There we are. This is a 2-year span. I changed the dots here. I don't know why.
Kyle, what's CNCF?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, CNCF is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I got tied up there for a second. Yeah, CNCF. Thank you. And so the CNCF is where we contribute a lot of projects to. Kubernetes is inside of that. Prometheus is inside of it. But yeah, so there's our contributions. Like, I don't like to downplay how important open source software is because we're heavily committed to it. We consistently contribute a lot, and like Google has the resources to do that. Like, we're very fortunate that's the case. But that doesn't mean that it's easy to do, and we obviously pay a lot of people to focus on that. So when you start to think about open source software and you start really thinking about the contributions and why that matters, I don't mean to imply that it's not important, that you shouldn't use it. Like, we're really all in on open source. And like I said, for me personally, that was like a big reason why I came to Google after I left Red Hat. I'm gonna walk you through like a really quick idea of why this matters. Is like when we started looking at, if you're familiar with Prometheus, if you're not, I'll briefly explain that Prometheus is sort of the de facto standard for Kubernetes monitoring. Specifically around time series metrics. Now, there can be some debate about that. You can maybe use another tool, that's okay. But when we talk about this, I'm gonna highlight that, this actually came out of Google, right? It originally was a project called Borgmon. And Borgmon grew and grew and grew. We ultimately sort of evolved this into a tool inside of Google called Monarch. Now, Borgmon actually was essentially forked by a couple of engineers that went to SoundCloud, and SoundCloud is really where Prometheus, as it stands today, was invented, but it was based roughly off of Borgmon and how we monitored workloads inside of Google. I think it was 2012 that they founded that project originally at SoundCloud. So it's been around. I mean, it was around for a long time inside of Google. It ultimately evolved because we hit some of some of our own constraints around that sort of model, and as we started looking at this, we built out our managed service for Prometheus just because it has taken such a strong foothold inside the space. But there's a lot of challenges to it. And so it's not to say that we don't believe fundamentally in open source. It's that when you really make the cost considerations and you have to think about this, like there's more factors than just like I'm gonna pull software off the shelf. And I think everyone sort of implicitly understands that, but if you don't, or if your teams don't, it can weigh on teams a lot. This is the quote. I think this is like sort of back to the Gratis v. Libre. It's free speech, not free beer, right? And that's maybe like an easier sort of like less verbose way of saying this. I think this is a really nice summary of like, there's always a cost to something when you deploy it in an enterprise, when you deploy it in a startup. It's always going to matter. And so you have to be tactical about that, and you have to really be considerate about how you're spending your time and resources. I'll come back to back to sort of hidden costs here. I don't think this is a hidden cost, but I like to sort of drive it home for people. I think the idea here is when you think about resource costs, this is the one that people think about most. So people don't think about the human cost, people don't think about the opportunity cost. I think people generally think about this, and this is sort of their baseline. And it's like, well, if I run it, if I run it on a server underneath my desk, right, like it doesn't cost me anything. I already have that server, and that's a great way to start. It's a terrible way to scale. So now that I've gone through all the different ways that we burn money, I'm going to hand it off to Benji to talk a little bit through how we approach our software and what we're trying to do for Google Cloud customers.
Thanks, Cal.
Yeah.
So I think you can think about Google Cloud's approach in one key statement. It's really the path of least resistance or out of the box. So whether you're a developer building applications on GCP, a business analyst extracting intelligence to make informed decisions, or a security analyst who's really managing cybersecurity risk, or the platform admin who's managing that platform for a large enterprise because you're working on one, maybe multiple clouds, Google Cloud Operations has really built the tooling you need to get your job done. So we've made it compatible with open source, just like Kyle just mentioned. Whether it's with Prometheus, OpenTelemetry, or even FluentBit, you can bring those assets, those metrics, dashboards, or alert rules into cloud operations. Every GCP service has really created, or not every, a majority of GCP services have really provided a day zero experience for observability. So the moment that you make that deployment, the moment that you leverage that service, you can start analyzing the system performance health, the trends, and start troubleshooting issues immediately. So all that data that's being generated, the metrics, the logs that we provide for you out of the box, is really stored in our planet scale data platforms. These data platforms, as Kyle was mentioning, for time series, we call it Monarch, but we also support with BigQuery. And through that accessibility, you now have a suite of diagnostic tools that are available to you for you to explore that data. You can explore your metrics, your logs, you can build dashboards, you can set up alerts so that you can work with proactive workflows in the future. Ultimately, this is the power of Google Cloud Operations. So let's go back to that e-commerce shop example that we talked a little bit about earlier. Let's ask one more time. What is important for an e-commerce shop? You want to minimize abandonment, or Liam Neeson's giving you a call. So, no, I'm just kidding. It'll be a sales rep. Let's take a look at a self-managed setup within the popular open source ecosystem. So here you can see a typical self-managed open source Prometheus setup. You have the push gateway with short-lived jobs. You have the pre-configured alert rules with the alert manager. You have your metrics being defined with open metrics in the Prometheus server that's handling all that. And then you have this query language called PromQL. It's just another query language that you have to learn alongside all these other query languages. And Grafana is generally the dashboarding tool that's preferred on top of Prometheus for data visualization and for data export. This is kind of tough, because it's really difficult to scale horizontally in an enterprise. If you're a startup, it might work for you. But the moment you have multiple engineering teams, development teams that are trying to spin up their own instance of this, good luck trying to manage all that and standardize it, which brings us to the next challenge. It's really difficult to do global aggregations, right, with all these different instances, because now you have to manage all that ETL, all those different ingestion workflows that are being set up. And then the third challenge is really around historical data, right? How do you manage historical data? How do you do those year-over-year analysis? Where are you storing all that information, right? You think about Google Cloud, again, we are the data platform for a reason. And lastly, I think all this work that you're putting into it is really an operational burden. It's taking attention, resources, capacities away from your customers into managing your own setup, when in reality, you could really have allocated that to actual features that deliver value or differentiate your business. So there is a path. It's the path of least resistance with Google Cloud Operations. You could really have Google manage all of that for you. So Google, as I mentioned before, it's open source compatible, so you can bring all those assets into the cloud while unlocking competitive pricing. You have global aggregation capabilities. And most importantly, you also start to unlock a different value prop. It's Google as a partner. Google's roadmap is focused on AI. So as Google Cloud Operations roadmap with AI starts to evolve, AI operations, you'll start to benefit from that. That's, as I mentioned, as Kyle kind of mentioned earlier, that's compatibility with Prometheus and open source, but you unlock those data platforms, you unlock Vertex AI, ML, the model garden, all those capabilities with your data set that will allow you to build customized workflow or even start considering automated workflows. So ultimately, Google is really committed to building products that you're gonna love. So gaining that partnership is, I say, it's a pretty great value prop. But there's one more. Google can scale. That's 65 quadrillion metric points on disk. There's 2 trillion active time series inside of Google, supporting Google Search and all of our other products, but with Google Cloud as well. Now I get it, these are really big numbers, and sometimes it's hard to really fathom what do these numbers actually mean. Carol, can you provide an example of, let's bring this down to earth.
Yeah, I think if we take, it's probably the easiest thing to take a look at is this slide, and this is actually from Grafana, and so Grafana is a partner of ours. This is from them running this in an open source capacity, but this is a 2022 performance blog post from them, focused on performance for Prometheus stack. And so if you sort of think about, this is to get to a billion active time series, right? So a billion active time series in Mimr, which is their aggregation tool if you have multiple federated Prometheus. I actually don't know if the Prometheus is. But yeah, like, so the scale here, when you start to look at this and like, this is maybe achievable for one organization when you need to have multiple, when you need to have, especially if you're in a large organization, it just doesn't, there's a sort of like a diseconomies of scale here, right? That's something one of our coworkers, Lee, loves to say all the time, but this is achievable for one. It's really not achievable for multiple, and as you start to grow beyond that, like this is just raw compute costs as opposed to any of the additional management stuff. It takes a massive amount of compute to get to 1 billion time series for your organization. That's, again, it is achievable, and if you're a really intense engineering organization, like, it's doable. It's just like, if you want to spend the cost in there, it's ultimately going to be up to you and how you decide that inside of your team.
I think the important takeaway here is that you have 1,500 replicas of that instance just to reach 1 billion active time series. Or, day 0, you can get it out of the box by Google and be able to scale up and know that you have up to 2 trillion in scale, right? It's a no-brainer. So let's actually jump into this operation suite and show you what this day 0 experience might look like. If you've seen the opening keynote, you may have seen a presentation with the alert reaction workflow, the alert workflow where you're responding to an alert, you're looking at the metrics, maybe you're navigating with PromQL. There's a couple AI features to do natural language exploration, and then you're kind of explaining a log. That is something I would probably call more of a proactive workflow because you've already pre-configured the telemetry, you've set up the alert, you know what you're monitoring. What we're going to show you today is a bit more of the reactive workflow. What happens when you didn't set up that alert, right? You actually don't know where the problem is and there's a needle in the haystack. So let's jump into that demo.
Jump to the next slide. One more. There we are, okay. So I might click and pause through this, but we'll start here. So this is, there's actually like a 10-second delay just when I was recording it, but when we go through this, so this is a GKE cluster out of the box. We actually deployed one of our Jumpstart solutions, which is something else we can talk about if you're interested. But this deployment automatically handles, is it going?
It is going.
It is going, okay. That was just me taking a while. So this is going through, this is automatically going to show you what's available. So this is our observability and context view. As soon as you deploy a cluster, this is available to you. There's no cost for this. All the metrics that we ingest in this view are automatically provided to you. And then, on the logging side, which we'll talk about a little later, there's only a charge for logs that you keep. So all metrics on this view are free. Here we're jumping into sort of a new view for us, which is an attempt at making this data meaningful to people who may not have as much operational experience. So if we click through, could you pause right there, Benji?
Perfect.
Thanks. So if you click through, which I just did, this is our new view on troubleshooting playbooks. Now, in this particular case, I had a pod that was failing. It was just, a Python script that would just exit. And then, Kubernetes would restart it. That's what Kubernetes is supposed to do. But in this particular situation, we identified and were able to tell that there was a crash looping pod and automatically gave some proactive troubleshooting tips for you here. So as you scroll down, you can go ahead and hit play. As we scroll down, we can see a little bit more of what's going on. We saw a big spike in the crashing here. And then as we go down, there's logs. I just wrote like an exiting now just to sort of show you, like, we're pulling this all in from the pod. We're pulling the metrics in as well as the logs from the pod. And then we're going to provide a little bit more information from the Kubernetes cluster itself. Now, there's nothing here that's going on that's really crazy. You can see a little bit of log messages. We'll also provide an alert so that if you're seeing this again and you want to proactively avoid it in the future, you can jump into that alert. Now, that alert will direct you right back to this playbook. So if in the future you have an issue, it's fairly easy to sort of get back to this automatic troubleshooting without any context or knowledge that's required from you to set this up. We've rolled out a few of these so far. We just introduced them last month, but we have 4 or 5 now that are recently published as well. So let's go back to that cluster. We have a microservice demo. It's a demo of an e-commerce shop, right? Back to the screenshot we saw before. If we take a look at, I'm going to click through to this front-end deployment, and we're going to jump into the container logs for this deployment. So here, maybe I just want to get a little bit of operational data of this. I want to figure out, without having to instrument my application, what telemetry is available. I just need to figure out what's going on. Here I'm going to run a script I've slightly modified, or that sort of queue. Can you pause it real quick? Thanks, Ben. So one of the things you'll notice is when I click through, we keep all the context automatically. So as soon as you click through into container logs, we know where you're coming from, so we know that you're specifically focused on this cluster in this region, in this specific container. Now there's a couple of different jump points that you can sort of maintain this. So if you have this application running across multiple clusters, or if it's distributed globally, you can maintain that context for a global view or for an individual view. I just happen to choose this specific cluster and this instance of that front-end application. So I'm going to modify it and add the product and just a quick search on the payload to say serving product page. Now, I've already created this, but what I could do from here with this payload is create a metric. And you can sort of see that right here. I'll show you what that looks like in a second if I've already created it. So you go there. Oh, thanks. We click on View Metrics Explorer. I'm going to let Benji talk a little bit about the Metrics Explorer because that's the area he really works on.
Yeah. So as I mentioned to you earlier, all these diagnostic tools are available to you out of the box as long as that data is being generated within Google Cloud, whether you're sending that data or whether we're providing it for you. So after creating a log-based metric, so you're able to monitor that error, you're able to explore that data directly within the Metrics Explorer. Go ahead and hit enter. The Metrics Explorer allows you to explore that data. You can really just see the insights pretty quickly. Now, that's just with exploration. What Google also offers you is the ability to query that with your own query languages. So as we mentioned, there is a PromQL compatibility in case you do prefer writing your own PromQL queries because you just have those advanced use cases. Keep playing?
Yep.
So if we move over to the dashboards list, what you'll find, pause. What you'll find is a list of all your dashboards, but these are not just dashboards that you generated, they're also the dashboards that we provide for you out of the box just for using our services. These are the best practice metrics, golden signals, CPU, memory, things you should be looking at if you're monitoring one of your applications. Let's go ahead and click one of the GKE out of the box dashboards. Pause, oh, yep. So this is the GKE, oh, keep playing. This is a GKE out-of-the-box dashboard. I'm going to want to customize it. So I'm going to hit copy on the top right-hand corner. And we'll get to that dashboard in just a second for the sake of this demo. And with just a single click, you're able to customize a version of one of our dashboards within one of your own customized views to view those key KPIs and see how that Kubernetes is performing. Now, this new experience is the dashboard builder, which was recently redesigned a few times, and about a month ago we went general availability with this new experience. If you add widget, you can actually see, pause here, you can actually see that the dashboard builder is expanding across multiple data sources. So you can really bring your metrics, your logs, your alerts, your incidents. In the future, it will be BigQuery and eventually SQL Analytics to be able to create a single pane of glass with your dashboards, whether you're monitoring the user experience or the application tier, infrastructure, platform, or networking, and eventually business insights. So moving forward and hit metric. The Metric Explorer opens up. We're going to go ahead and select a metric. After selecting a metric, you're going to get the list of all your metrics that we provide for you or that you've brought into the platform or generated via logs. We'll click the metric that Kyle just created. After clicking that metric, you'll be able to view the data. In this case, we're looking at product page requests. Hit apply. The data is then returned. We'll hit apply. And just like that, we went from a best practice Google-provided dashboard to a customized dashboard with your own analytics and your own insights, so you can monitor your unique application. We're going to talk a little bit about a product that is just launching now. Recently went into general availability.
February, yep.
In February, which is logs analytics, which is something you might see in the world with SQL analytics, being able to monitor your audit logs, or, some folks really like to use SQL. So let's move to that.
Yeah, so when we think about sort of the views and logging, going back to originally the thing I showed you. Oh, oops. Can you fix that for me?
Okay. Oh,
yeah. There we go. Gotcha. So originally we went back and we looked at the log view. Sorry, the demo, the work through on this is a little weird with the video. But so anyway, when we're looking at the prior logs experience, the Logs Explorer, which we looked at first to create this metric, is really focused on, could you pause it? Is really focused on sort of exploring. And so when you're in an active troubleshooting scenario, or when you are dealing with an immediate response, something is going on, you got an alert, whatever. The Logs Explorer is you want to go to dig into a specific incident. As you saw earlier with Priyanka in the keynote, we have error reporting, you have the ability to sort of bubble up those errors. But we introduced log analytics because one of the things we increasingly saw was just that customers wanted more flexibility around exploring their data, and I would say like a more biz ops or security ops focused way. And so log analytics is our sort of introduction into that. Now, it doesn't replace SIEM tools that are really focused on like a security specific use case, but it does allow us some really nice flexibility with this data. So I'll show this query to you in a second, but what you're looking at here is the payload that we just had with the same product values, and I'm going to run this through to actually generate a quick chart on what's going on. So you can see the initial results I have are just a flat table of everything that's happened, and what we're sorting on is the number of product requests that I've had over a period of time that I was running on it, as well as any specific codes that we might be reporting on. Now you notice like most of these down here are 200. We had a couple of nulls up here, and I'm not sure why. It's something with the application. But we could see the sort of overall popularity of products just sort of organized by the number of requests that we've had within the time frame on this. Go ahead and hit play. If I wanted to, I can actually jump into the charting view here. This is currently in preview. It just went live a couple of weeks ago. And I'm just going to organize this and clean it up to look a little bit nicer. So we'll change that. We'll add a breakdown component. So if I want to add any codes that we may have gotten, I don't think I have 10 codes, but you can sort of see really quickly, and go ahead and pause. This is sort of the view of the breakdown of what we're looking at, where we now have, how many products, what the products were requested at, and sort of what the overall status of that product request was. So if we're getting a bunch of null recalls, like we need to figure out what's going on there. But overall, our goal here is to try and provide a tool that allows you to flexibly slice and dice your log data in a way that might be more relevant to your business as opposed to like an active troubleshooting scenario. So we're going to wrap up. There's a couple of things we'll say just to consider right again, like the opportunity cost, human costs, outage costs, and resource costs. These matter, some of them more than others. I would argue human costs might matter than all of them, but it just sort of depends on your leaning there. And I think when you think about this, finding the right fit for how your organization prioritizes work, it's not going to be one size fits all. Google has a methodology for this. Other people have their own methodologies, and that's okay, but it's important to consider the factors. If you want to reach out to us, I will say we have, we'll be in the booths the next couple of days. Booth duty, it gets downstairs in the DevOps Innovators Hive. I'll also recommend a couple of sessions. So we have some fairly hands-on sessions coming up, right? So observability for troubleshooting optimization with OpenTelemetry. I mentioned we're really, really invested in the open source space, and that really comes to light with OpenTelemetry. If you're not familiar with that, I would strongly encourage you to check out OpenTelemetry and understand what's going on in that space. It's really important for how we're going to implement and instrument stuff, but it's also a really great standard in that space, and we think people are going to get a lot of value out of it. Check out our Duet AI deep dive, and then the 10 best practices and scaling with our partner over at Snap. So I think that's it for our slides. So we'd love feedback, I guess I should say. Please give us feedback, and then thank you. Thank you.